This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, we'll do it this way. Let me thank the current and former directors, Elena Villamontes and J. Robert Lennon, as well as Marianne Marsh, Sarah Rice, and Lauper for organizing this event. It takes a long time to do these things. I would also like to just take a moment and thank the EPIC staff and Michael Cook, who are at work publishing the next generation of classic American fiction. Of course, the EPIC staff is going to be, and poetry. EPIC staff also contains future famous writers. But this seems a particular time, a good time at the end of the year to thank them for their work, because EPIC is the place that I think published the first story that appeared in print from Jesus' Son. It was a story called Out on Bail, and one of the books that's among our favorites. Thank you, Barbara and David Zalaznick, whose endowment allowed the Department of English to bring Denis Johnson to Cornell in 2008 for a semester as a visiting writer, and who've been bringing writers, the Zalaznicks have been bringing writers to Cornell for 8 years, including this semester, we're very happy to say, Karen Joy Fowler. The Zalaznicks support our reading series as well. Denis Johnson won the National Poetry Series Award for The Incognito Lounge, the National Book Award for his novel Tree of Smoke, and is a recipient of many grants and fellowships, including a Whiting, a Guggenheim, and a Lannan. In addition to being a poet, a short story writer, a novelist, he's an essayist, and he's a reporter, and he's even what I would call a war reporter. Reporting from Africa, reporting from Iraq. He's also a playwright whose plays actually get produced. And that's a major achievement for a playwright. He's a screenwriter, and even on occasion an actor, having had the most memorable, the tiniest, but also the most memorable role in the film that was made out of his collection of stories, Jesus' Son. He is above all a writer whom for more than 30 years has been, let me try that syntax again. He's a writer who for more than 30 years has been one of the ones that people read for pleasure, millions of people by now read for pleasure, and whom writers read for pleasure and for instruction. His characters must be hard to live with when he's writing about some of them. They're dissolute, broken down, unethical, immoral, amoral, narcissistic, deadbeat, drug-addled, semi-conscious. And some of them, though, are just people who've had hard luck. Some of them have just had bad luck. Even the murderers who didn't mean to murder anyone. Circumstances just seem to conspire against those people. Some of them are friends who did not find the means to act when friends could have been saved from dying. You would not think that millions of people would want to read about these people until you read the prose, which is lyrical, stunning, and often unexpectedly hilarious. Many of the characters, if not all of them, seem to be living through or approaching an apocalypse with a dim sense that there may be just a possibility, by chance, to join angels later. Angels is the title of one of his great novels. And angels figure in a very kind of sneaky, covert way into a scene in Jesus' Son, in which the main character thinks of these angels floating in a blue sky above gravestones, tombstones below. It turns out to be just a movie picture in an outdoor movie theater that is showing to no audience during a snow shower. I call that rather apocalyptic. I do not know Dennis well, but I know him to have a kind, generous spirit. Two anecdotes. When he was here for a semester, he was the only faculty member in the Department of English who attended every single graduate student reading, fiction and poetry reading. And when he was here, he had a play produced in New York City, and can I call it off Broadway? And he invited his entire undergraduate class to go down for the opening of that play. And Cornell, with the help of the Zalaznicks, whom I think once again managed to send all these people to Dennis, who looked after them very generously in New York City. So we're very glad to have him back, to thank him for the semester he gave us, to thank him for the many books he's written since 2008, and to welcome a good writer. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks. And let me thank not just Stephanie for that very kind introduction, but the Department of English, Cornell University, the Creative Writing Program, and Barbara and David Zalaznick, who are bankrolling this job, I think. I'm going to read some pages. I'm trying to think. I was about to deny everything Stephanie said about the characters, at least in this selection. But I think toward the end we may get into a little drug addlement. But I don't think I'm going to read about anybody dissolute tonight. I'm not sure I know what dissolute means, but I'm trying to think how to kind of lead into what I'm going to read. Several years ago, I was teaching a course at Texas State University in San Marcos, and I asked the students to write something short, 2 pages. And I also like to do the assignments myself. And so I wrote a 2-page thing, and then it began to kind of, the voice attracted me. It seemed to be kind of an older advertising agency kind of guy. And then I wrote some more short pieces where he's telling the story. And then they kind of all joined together, but each one with a title of its own, into a longer business selection, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, I'll read a couple of those, and it's nice to be able to read short things, like just 2, 3 pages, 6 pages, because I don't know, when I go to a reading, if somebody gets 1 page into their thing and I don't like it, I think, oh God, we're going to be here, like for 40 minutes, and yeah. But in this case, if I get 1 page into it and you don't like it, you just think, well, there'll be another one in a few minutes. Maybe that'll be better. So this is the first one, and it's called Silences. After dinner, nobody went home right away. I think we'd enjoyed the meal so much, we hoped Elaine would serve us the whole thing all over again. These were people we've gotten to know a little from Elaine's volunteer work. Nobody from my work, nobody from the ad agency. We sat around in the living room describing the loudest sounds we'd ever heard. One said it was his wife's voice when she told him she didn't love him anymore and wanted a divorce. Another recalled the pounding of his heart when he suffered a coronary. Tia Jones had become a grandmother at the age of 37 and hoped never again to hear anything so loud as her granddaughter crying in her 16-year-old daughter's arms. Her husband, Ralph, said it hurt his ears whenever his brother opened his mouth in public. Because his brother had Tourette's syndrome and erupted with remarks like, I masturbate, your penis smells good, in front of perfect strangers on a bus or during a movie or even in church. Young Chris Case reversed the direction and introduced the topic of silences. He said the most silent thing he'd ever heard was the landmine taking off his right leg outside Kabul, Afghanistan. As for other silences, nobody contributed. In fact, there came a silence now. Some of us hadn't realized that Chris had lost a leg. I didn't even know he'd fought in Afghanistan. A landmine, I said. Yes, sir, a landmine. Can we see it? Deirdre said. No, ma'am, Chris said. I don't carry landmines around on my person. No, I mean your leg. It was blown off. I mean the part that's still there. I'll show you, he said, if you kiss it. Shocked laughter. We started talking about the most ridiculous things we'd ever kissed. Nothing of interest. We'd all kissed only people, and only in the usual places. All right then, Chris told Deirdre, here's your chance for the conversation's most unique entry. No, I don't want to kiss your leg. Although none of us showed it, I think we all felt a little irritated with Deirdre. We all wanted to see. Morton Sands was there too that night, and for the most part, he'd managed to keep quiet. Now he said, Jesus Christ, Deirdre. Oh, well. Okay, she said. Chris pulled up his right pant leg, bunching the cuff about halfway up his thigh, and detached his prosthesis, a device of chromium bars and plastic belts strapped to his knee, which was intact and swiveled upward horribly to present the puckered end of his leg. Deirdre got down on her bare knees before him, and he hitched forward in his seat, the couch. Ralph Jones was sitting beside him, to move the scarred stump within 2 inches of Deirdre's face. Now she started to cry. Now we were all embarrassed, a little ashamed. For nearly a minute, we waited. Then Ralph Jones said, Chris, I remember when I saw you fight 2 guys at once outside the Aces Tavern. No kidding, Jones told the rest of us. He went outside with these 2 guys and beat the crap out of both of them. I guess I could have given them a break, Chris said. They were both pretty drunk. Chris, you sure kicked some ass that night. In the pocket of my shirt, I had a wonderful Cuban cigar. I wanted to step outside with it. The dinner had been one of our best, and I wanted to top off the experience with a satisfying smoke. But you want to see how this sort of thing turns out. How often will you witness a woman kissing an amputation? Jones, however, had ruined everything by talking. He'd broken the spell. Chris worked the prosthesis back into place and tightened the straps and rearranged his pant leg. Deirdre stood up and wiped her eyes and smoothed her skirt and took her seat, and that was that. The outcome of all this was that Chris and Deirdre, about 6 months later, down at the courthouse, in the presence of very nearly the same group of friends, were married by a magistrate. Yes, they're husband and wife. You and I know what goes on. Now, you don't have to applaud at the end of every one of these things. It kind of, yeah, you know, now it's like, crap, do I have to applaud for the next one too? You know? At a poetry reading, I don't think we applaud for every poem, do we? No, okay. This one is called Farewell. Elaine got a wall phone for the kitchen, a sleek blue one that wears its receiver like a hat with a caller ID readout on its face just below the keypad. While I eyeballed this instrument, having just come in from my visit with the chiropractor, a brisk, modest tone began, and the tiny screen showed 10 digits I didn't recognize. My inclination was to scorn it like any other unknown. But this was the first call, the inaugural message. As soon as I touched the receiver, I wondered if I'd regret this, if I was holding a mistake in my hand, if I was pulling this mistake to my head and saying hello to it. The caller was my first wife, Virginia, or Ginny, as I'd always called her. We'd been married long ago in our early 20s and put a stop to it after 3 crazy years. Since then, we hadn't spoken. We'd had no reason to. But now we had one. Ginny was dying. Her voice came faintly. She told me the doctors had closed the book on her. She'd ordered her affairs. The good people from hospice were in attendance. Before she ended this earthly transit, as she called it, Ginny wanted to shed any kind of bitterness against certain people, certain men, especially me. She said how much she'd been hurt and how badly she wanted to forgive me, but she didn't know whether she could or not. She hoped she could. And I assured her from the abyss of a broken heart that I hoped so too, that I hated my infidelities and my lies about the money and the way I'd kept my boredom secret and my secrets in general. And Ginny and I talked after 40 years of silence about the many other ways I'd stolen her right to the truth. In the middle of this, I began wondering most uncomfortably, in fact with a dizzy, sweating anxiety, if I'd made a mistake, if this wasn't my first wife, Ginny, no, but rather my second wife, Jennifer, often called Jenny. Because of the weakness of her voice and my own humming shock at the news, also the situation around her as she tried to speak to me on this very important occasion, folks coming and going and the sounds of a respirator, I supposed. Now, 15 minutes into this call, I couldn't remember if she'd actually said her name when I picked up the phone. And I suddenly didn't know which set of crimes I was regretting. Wasn't sure if this dying farewell, clobbering me to my knees in true repentance beside the kitchen table, was Virginia's or Jennifer's. This is hard, I said. Can I put the phone down a minute? I heard her say, okay. The house felt empty. Elaine, I called. Nothing. I wiped my face with a dish rag and took off my blazer and hung it on a chair and called out Elaine's name one more time and then picked up the receiver again. There was nobody there. Somewhere inside it, the phone had preserved the caller's number, of course, Ginny's number or Jenny's, but I didn't look for it. We'd had our talk, and Ginny or Jenny, whichever, had recognized herself in my frank apologies, and she'd been satisfied. Because, after all, both sets of crimes had been the same. I was tired. What a day. I called Elaine on her cell phone. We agreed she might as well stay at the Budget Inn on the east side. She volunteered out there teaching adults to read, and once in a while she got caught late and stayed over. Good. I could lock all 3 locks on the door and call it a day. I didn't mention the previous call. I turned in early. I dreamed of a wild landscape, elephants, dinosaurs, bat caves, strange natives, and so on. I woke, couldn't go back to sleep, put on a long terry cloth robe over my PJs and slipped into my loafers and went walking. People in bathrobes stroll around here at all hours, but not often, I think, without a pet on a leash. Ours is a good neighborhood, a Catholic church and a Mormon one, and a posh townhouse development with much open green space, and on our side of the street, some pretty nice smaller homes. I wonder if you're like me, if you collect and squirrel away in your soul certain odd moments when the mystery winks at you. When you walk in your bathrobe and tasseled loafers, for instance, out of your neighborhood and among a lot of closed shops, and you approach your very faint reflection in a window with words above it. The sign said, "Sky and celery." Closer, it read, "Ski and cyclery." I headed home. I think when I take a sip, that's a signal that we've reached the end of one. This one is called Casanova. When I returned to New York City to pick up my prize at the American Advertisers Awards, I'm not sure I expected to enjoy myself. But on the second day, killing time before the ceremony, walking north through Midtown in my dark ceremonial suit and trench coat, skirting the park, strolling south again, feeling the pulse and listening to the traffic noise rising among high buildings, I had a homecoming. The day was sunny, fine for walking, brisk and getting brisker. And in fact, as I cut a diagonal through a little plaza somewhere above 40th Street, the last autumn leaves were swept up from the pavement and thrown around our heads, and a sudden misty quality in the atmosphere above seemed to solidify into a ceiling both dark and luminous. And the passers-by hunched into their collars, and 2 minutes later the gusts had settled into a wind, not hard, but steady and cool, and my hands dove into my coat pockets. A bit of rain speckled the pavement. Random snowflakes spiraled in the air. All around me, people seemed to be evacuating the scene, while across the square, a vendor shouted that he was closing his cart and you could have his wares for practically nothing. And for no reason I could have named, I bought 2 of his rat dogs with everything and a cup of doubtful coffee, and then learned the reason. They were wonderful. I nearly ate the napkin. New York. Once I lived here. This is not a signal that it's over. This is just a sign that I'm thirsty. Once I lived here, went to Columbia University, studying history first, then broadcast journalism. Worked for a couple of pointless years at the Post, and then for 13 tough but prosperous years at Castle and Forbes on 54th, just off Madison Avenue. And then took my insomnia, my afternoon headaches, my doubts, and my antacid tablets to San Diego and lost them in the Pacific Ocean. New York and I didn't quite fit. I knew it the whole time. Some of my Columbia classmates came from faraway places like Iowa and Nevada, as I had come a shorter way from New Hampshire, and after graduation, they'd been absorbed into Manhattan and had lived here ever since. I didn't last. I always say, it was never my town. Today, it was all mine. Today, I was its proprietor. With my overcoat wide open and the wind in my hair, I walked around and for an hour or so presided over the bits of litter in the air, so much less than 30 years ago, and the citizens bent against the weather, and the light inside the restaurants, and the people at small tables looking at each other's faces and talking. The white flakes began to stick. By the time I entered Trump Tower, I'd had a long, hard, wet walk. I repaired myself in the restroom and found the right floor. At the ceremony, my table was near the front, round, clothed in burgundy, and surrounded by 8 of us, the other 7 much younger than I, a lively bunch, fun and full of wisecracks. And they seemed impressed to be sitting with me and made sure I sat where I could see. All that was the good part. Halfway through dessert, a nerve in my back began to act up, and by the time I heard my name and started toward the podium, my right shoulder blade felt as if it were pressed against a hissing old New York steam heat radiator. At the head of the vast room, I held the medallion in my hand. That's what it was rather than a trophy, an inscribed medallion, 3 inches in diameter, good for a paperweight, and thanked a list of names I'd memorized, omitted any other remarks, and got back to my table just as another pain seized me, this one in the region of my bowels, and now I repented my curbside lunch, my delicious New York hot dogs, especially the second one, and without sitting down or even making an excuse, I let this bout of indigestion carry me out of the room and down the halls to the men's lavatory, where I hardly had time to fumble the medallion into my lapel pocket and get my jacket on the hook. I sat down with my intestines in flames, first my body bearing this insult, and then my soul insulted too, when someone came in and chose the stall next to mine. Our public toilets are just that, too public. The walls don't reach the floor. This other man and I could see each other's feet, or at any rate, our black shoes and the cuffs of our dark trousers. After a minute, His hand laid on the floor between us, there at the border between his space and mine, a square of toilet paper with an obscene proposition written on it, in words large and plain enough that I could read them whether I wanted to or not. In pain, I laughed, not out loud. I heard a small sigh from the next stall. By hunching down into my own embrace and staring hard at my feet, I tried to make myself go away. I didn't acknowledge his overture, and he didn't leave. He must have taken it that I had him under consideration. As long as I stayed, he had reason to hope. And I couldn't leave yet. My bowels churned and smoldered. Renegade signals from my spinal nerve hammered my shoulder and the full length of my right arm down to the marrow. The award ceremony seemed to have ended. The men's room came to life. The door whooshing open, the run of voices coming in, throats and faucets and footfalls, the spin of the paper towel dispenser. Somewhere in here, a hand descended to the note on the floor. Fingers touched it, raised it away. Soon after that, the man, the toilet Casanova, was no longer beside me. I stayed as I was. For how long, I couldn't say. There were echoes, silence, the urinals flushing themselves. I raised myself upright, pulled my clothing together, made my way to the sinks. One other man remained in the place. He stood at the sink beside mine as our faucets ran. I washed my hands. He washed his hands. He was tall, with a distinctive head, wispy, colorless hair like a baby's, and a skeletal face with thick red lips. I'd have known him anywhere. Carl Zane. He smiled in a small way. Wrong. I'm Marshall Zane. I'm Carl's son. Sure, of course, he would have aged too. This encounter had me going in circles. I'd finished washing my hands, and now I started washing them again. I forgot to introduce myself. You look just like your dad, I said, only 25 years ago. Are you here for the awards night? He nodded. I'm with the Sextant Group. You followed in his footsteps. I did. I even worked for Castle and Forbes for a couple of years. How do you like that? And how's Carl doing? Is he here tonight? He passed away 3 years ago. Went to sleep one night and never woke up. Oh no. I had a moment, I have them sometimes, when the surroundings seemed bereft of any facts and not even the smallest physical gesture felt possible. After the spell had passed, I said, I'm sorry to hear that. He was a nice guy. At least it was painless, said the son of Carl Zane, and as far as anyone knows, he went to bed happy that night. We were talking to each other's reflections in the broad mirror. I made sure I didn't look elsewhere, at his trousers, his shoes. But for this occasion, we men, every one of us, had dressed in dark trousers and black shoes. Well, enjoy your evening, the young man said. I thanked him and said good night, and as he tossed a wadded paper towel at the receptacle and disappeared out the door, I'm afraid I added, tell your father I said hello. Well, that's just a selection from a longer bunch that kind of adds up into almost something. And that it was published under the title, The Largesse of the Sea Maiden. Then I've been doing similar things, writing these short pieces, but not really separating them, letting one flow into the next, and maybe things will loop around later and get back to something that was started. And so let me read you a little bit of something like that. You can sort of tell how one, you'll get a sense of how one might just wander into the next. And the title for this, if I ever finish it, is Triumph Over the Grave. I don't know what that has to do with any of the material so far, but I like the title. And so I will fix it as we go along so that it becomes, the material fits the title. I think that's what J.D. Salinger did with The Catcher in the Rye. It's such a catchy, weird title, but then he has the lamest reason for it to be the title. Do you recall the book? Like in the end, Holden Caulfield starts talking about sort of a vision he has about a person who catches children before they wander in the rye off a cliff, and he's the catcher in the rye. I mean, it's the silliest thing, but it does provide a reason for calling the book The Catcher in the Rye, and it's such a nice title. Anyway, Triumph Over the Grave. Right now, I'm eating bacon and eggs in a large restaurant. Oh, let me say too, the speakers, he seems a little bit like this guy that we were just hearing from in these other pieces, but this is much more plainly me. It's sort of semi-autobiographical or pseudo-fictional memoirish or semi-fictional memoir. It's kind of, say between 60 and 62% me. Triumph Over the Grave. Right now, I'm eating bacon and eggs in a large restaurant in San Francisco. It's sunny, noisy, crowded. In fact, every table's full. And so I'm sitting at the bar that runs the room's entire length, maybe 40 feet, and I'm facing the mirror so that the restaurant behind me lies spread out before me, and I'm free to stare at everyone with impunity from behind my back, so to speak, while little yelps and laughs from their chopped-up conversations sort of rain down around me. I notice a woman behind me, her reflection, sharing breakfast at a table with her friends, and there's something very familiar about her. Okay, I've realized, after staring at her a bit, quite without her knowledge, that her face looks very much like the face of a friend of mine who lives in Boston, Nan, Robert's wife. I don't mean it's Nan. Nan in Boston is a brunette, whereas this one's a blonde and somewhat younger. But there's so much of Nan in the way this woman moves her mouth, and something about her fingers, her manner of gesturing with them as she speaks, as if she's ridding them of dust, just as Nan does, that I wonder if the two might be related somehow. Sisters, cousins. And the idea isn't far-fetched, because I know Nan in Boston actually comes from San Francisco, and she has family here. An impulse. I think I'll call Nan and Robert. They're in my phone. Odd expression. I'm going to call. Okay, I just called Robert's number. Immediately, someone answered, and Nan's voice cried, "Randy!" No, I'm not Randy, and I tell her it's me. I have to get off the phone, Nan says. There's a family emergency. It's terrible because Robert, as in a movie, she breaks down sobbing after the name. I know what that means in a movie. Is Robert all right? No, he's, and more sobbing. Nan, what happened? Tell me what happened. He had a heart attack this morning. His heart just stopped. They couldn't save him. He's dead. I can't believe this statement. I ask her why she would say such a thing. She tells me again, Robert's dead. I can't talk now, she says. I've got a lot of people to call. I have to call my sister, all my family in San Francisco, because they loved him so dearly. I have to get off the line. And she did. I put away my phone and managed to write down that much of the conversation in this journal on this very page before my hand started shaking so badly I had to stop. I rotated on my bar stool, turned away from my half-eaten meal, and stared out over the crowd. I imagined Nan's fingers shaking too, touching the face of her own phone, calling her loved ones with the awful news. There's the blonde woman who looks so much like Nan. She stops eating, sets down her fork, rummages in her purse, takes out her cell phone. She places it against her ear and says, hello. I left my breakfast unfinished. and went back to the nearby hospital, where I dropped a friend of mine for some tests. We called him Wink, shortened from Winkelholtz. For many weeks now, I'd been staying with Wink in his home, acting as his chauffeur and appointments clerk, and often as his nurse. Wink was also dying, although he didn't like to admit it. Weak and sick, skeletally undernourished, he spent whole days describing for me his plans for the renovation of his house, which was falling apart and full of trash. He couldn't manage much more than to get up once or twice a day to use the bathroom or heat some milk and instant oatmeal in his microwave, could hardly turn the pages of a book, slept as much as 20 hours at a stretch, but he was charting a long future. Other days, he embraced the truth, made decisions about his property, instructed me as to his funeral, recalled his adventures, considered his regrets, spoke of departed friends, pondered his odds, wondered whether experience continues somehow after the heart stops. These days, Wink left his house only to visit medical people in buildings separated from one another by hundreds of miles, and that's where I came in. Now, while I sat in a waiting room and the technicians in radiology put him under scrutiny, making sure of what they already knew, I took out a pen and a notebook and finished jotting a quick account of my recent trip to the restaurant. I've reproduced it verbatim in the first few paragraphs above. Writing. It's easy work. The equipment isn't expensive, and you can pursue this occupation anywhere. You make your own hours, mess around the house in your pajamas, listening to jazz recordings and sipping coffee while another day makes its escape. You don't have to be high functioning, or even for the most part, functioning at all. If I could drink liquor without being drunk all the time, I'd certainly drink enough to be drunk half the time, and production wouldn't suffer. Bouts of poverty come along, anxiety, shocking debt, but nothing lasts forever. From rags to riches and back again, and more than once. Whatever happens to you, you put it on a page, work it into a shape, cast it in a light. It's not much different, really, from filming a parade of clouds across the sky and calling it a movie, although it has to be admitted that the clouds can descend, take you up, carry you to all kinds of places, some of them terrible, and you don't get back where you came from for years and years. Some of my peers believe I'm famous. Most of my peers have never heard of me. But it's nice to think you have a skill, you can produce an effect. I once entertained some children with a ghost story, and one of them fainted. I'll write a story for you right now. We'll call this story The Examination of My Right Knee. It's something that happened to me decades ago. I think I was 20 or 21. Since shortly after my 15th birthday, my right knee had been tricky, locking into place sometimes when I bent my leg and staying that way until I found just the combination of position and movement that would set the joint free again. For years, I'd tried ignoring the problem, but it had only gotten worse, and so I reported it to the experts at the university hospital. An X-ray indicated torn cartilage. The head of orthopedics himself was going to have a look, and I waited in a hallway outside his door in a green robe and paper slippers. This, incidentally, this was a classroom assignment, this little bit that I've begun now. I asked the students to write a short, true anecdote. This is all true, this business about the examination of my right knee. The part about the phone call and all that, that's not true. But this is 100% true, what I'm reading you now. So if you haven't lost track, well, I'll catch you up. The speaker, who is actually me, I had a trick knee and I was going to the university. This was the University of Iowa. I had an X-ray. They said the cartilage was torn and I would look at the specialist would look at it. The head of orthopedics himself was going to have a look, and I waited in a hallway outside his door in a green robe and paper slippers. Not much went on in this hallway. In fact, almost nothing. Now and then, a medical person in green or white padded by. After a while, about 50 feet along the corridor, a middle-aged man in a dark business suit started talking into a wall-mounted payphone. For most of the conversation, his back was turned to me, but at one point he pivoted with a certain frustrated energy, and a few of his words reached my ears. I was never an animal lover. At that moment, the door I was waiting for opened, and an orderly in white asked me to come in. I followed this orderly, not into a tiny examination room, but instead onto a brilliantly lit stage in an auditorium filled with quite a large audience. Hundreds of people, medical students as best I could make out against the glare illuminating me. This is true. Nobody had warned me I'd be exhibited. In the center of the stage, under blinding lamps of the kind portrait photographers use, the orderly helped me onto a gurney and posed me on my back like a pinup girl. The knee raised, the robe parted, my bare leg displayed. In those days, I took recreational drugs at every opportunity. And an hour or so earlier, as a way of preparing for this experience, or maybe just by coincidence, I'd ingested a lot of LSD, which had the effect of focusing my awareness more acutely on the pain in the knee, at the same time unmasking pain in itself as cosmically funny, as well as revealing the overwhelming, eternal vitality of the universe, especially of the dark surrounding audience who breathed and sighed in unison like one huge creature. The head of orthopedics approached me. He was either a large, almost gigantic person or a person who only seemed gigantic under the circumstances. He gripped my flesh with his seething monster hands and delivered a lecture while he manipulated my lower leg and fondled the joint in preparation, I felt pretty sure, of eating me. Now you'll see how the disfigured cartilage causes the joint to seize, he said. But he couldn't produce the effect and went on straightening and bending the leg at the knee and talking jibber-jabber. Meanwhile, I observed that the great void of extinction was swallowing the whole of reality at an unbelievable rate. And yet nothing could overcome our continual birthing into the present. And any moment it would become completely impossible to mistake anything for itself. Needless to say, I didn't mention any of this. The colossus of orthopedics clamped my thigh with one hand and my ankle with the other and cranked the lower leg around gently, then not so gently, saying, "Sometimes it takes a bit of fiddling." Still, the knee didn't lock. Before this vast audience of his students, he pronounced me a faker. "There's no condition here requiring any treatment at all," he said. He pointed at me with a finger that communicated billions of accusations simultaneously. "A lot of these young men are out to fool the medical establishment because they don't want to get drafted." Well, it was easy enough for me to get the knee to lock. I just had to bend my leg so the knee was raised and turn my foot 45 degrees to the right. The noise it made when it locked was disgusting. A horrid gulping thunk. The sound came from the pre-chaotic depths where good and evil were one thing. "Ah, you see," the mammoth said to his compatriot, the darkness. "Now you see." I understood this to mean he was about to turn me invisible, and soon after that he'd amuse the students by making me explode. Then I grasped that he was an orthopedic specialist who, having failed to get the knee locked until I'd done it for him, was now going to show his students how to unlock it again. But he couldn't do that either. After a lot of huffing and puffing and mumbo-jumbo, he collapsed in his inwardmost self and prayed unto the darkness for help. And his prayer was heard. The darkness furnished forth the unlocker, who seemed a loving emanation then a mysterious becoming, then a glorious actuality, and at last a sort of porky med student who jumped on my knee ass first, as you do if you wanted to shut a bulging suitcase. Again, the great sound, the gulp of God, and my bones were restored, and with an infinitude of applause too loud for human ears, creation burst its beginnings. The hero took my hand, and having been exhibited before the all, having been lain out and locked and unlocked, at his touch I was able to rise and walk. In the quiet hallway, I sat down alone. The man who'd been talking on the payphone was still there, still talking, as if nothing had ever happened. I strained to hear his magical words. For what it's worth, I'll repeat them here. He said, "Your dog, your dog, your dog. You were a fool to leave your dog with me." Thank you. The reason I haven't left is there's going to be some anticlimactic questioning and answering now. I mean, I can ask the questions. There are things I'm very confused about. Look, what's the difference between a mile and a nautical mile? I'd like to know. Yes.
I noticed that your fictional character in this last piece was really as just after he had it on the phone. And I've always wondered how you do dialogue so well. Is that something that you do, write down conversations?
I do. I eavesdrop a lot. The question was, how did my dialogue get so brilliant? Most of it was actually said by somebody. That's really what it is. Yeah, and I eavesdrop a lot, and if I hear something that sounds like it would be good on a page, then I, write it down. But there is a big difference between verbatim dialogue and then dialogue that sounds realistic on the page. And that's where the magic comes in. I wish I could reveal it, but, but no. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you. What's for you? What written decision to move from fiction to then experimenting with something that's 60 to 62% real? What two decisions were you making, or why were playing with?
I'm afraid I don't know. I think that was the answer right there. Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.